Welcome back to Plantopia. Plantopia is the plant health podcast of the American Phytopathological Society, and I'm your host, Matt Kasson. I'm an associate professor of forest pathology and mycology at West Virginia University. This is the fourth episode of Season 5 of Plantopia, and today I welcome 2025 APS Fellow Dr. Tim Widmer. Dr. Widmer is a plant pathologist and former USDA ARS researcher and national program leader for plant disease, a position he held until his retirement in May of 2024. He currently serves as an independent contractor as a plant health and biodefense specialist, advising both USDA ARS and private industry. Dr. Widmer completed a BA in chemistry from Goshen College in Indiana and a PhD in plant pathology from the University of Florida in Gainesville. He conducted his postdoctoral research at Cornell University, and he also holds leadership certificates from the Owen Graduate School of Management at Vanderbilt University and the School of Public Affairs at American University. Dr. Widmer's research career spans 24 years with the USDA ARS. His work primarily focused on biological control of invasive weeds and new and emerging pathogens. He's led teams around the globe focused on crop production, protection, and biosecurity. As National Program Leader from 2018 through 2024, he oversaw all USDA ARS national research programs, set research priorities, facilitated collaboration, as well as served as U.S. representative to the UN Methyl Bromide Technical Options Committee, chair on Canada-Mexico-U.S. Plant Health Task Force, and he oversaw the National Plant Disease Recovery System. He also served as acting deputy administrator for the crop production and protection, among other responsibilities. He has authored over 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles, many of which focused on Phytophthora, trichoderma as biocontrols, false rust disease caused by Syncytium as a biocontrol of yellow star thistle. Dr. Widmer is the recipient of numerous USDA ARS Performance Awards, including 4 Outstanding Performance Awards, 15 Superior Performance Awards, and the 2022 USDA Assistant Secretary Administrators Award in recognition for leading USDA inputs and development of the new National Biodefense Strategy. He is also one of this year's recipients of the APS Fellow Award. Dr. Widmer, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Congratulations on being elected a 2025 APS Fellow.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be selected.
For our listeners that may not be familiar with the Fellows Program, APS bestows the honor of Fellow to members of our professional society in recognition of distinguished contributions to the profession of plant pathology in one or more of several defined areas. Now, I suspect, given your former role as USDA ARS National Program Lead for Plant Diseases and long service with the USDA ARS, one of those areas for which you are being recognized is public service.
That's probably the primary reason, yes.
Certainly you have significant research contributions as well, but your dedication to public service is unparalleled in a lot of ways. So what does it mean to you to be recognized or to receive this award?
In attending all of the American Phytopathology Society meetings that I had a chance to attend, I always tried to attend the recognition ceremonies because it is an important aspect, I think, of the society. And to be then selected and recognized as in that capacity, it does mean a lot to me. It's something I didn't really expect, especially in my research capacity. I recognize that maybe it is not as groundbreaking as a lot of others. And so to be recognized in the public service arena is an important thing for me.
Well, I think especially as you work your way up this administrative ladder, it becomes harder and harder to do your own research. You're actually just helping others be able to do their research and do it effectively and providing resources they need to be successful.
Yeah, in 2018, when I accepted the position for National Program Leader, I completely gave up all research activities at that point and solely focused on, as you said, helping other ARS scientists and university scientists get together and collaborate and advance their science and research. And it's been very rewarding to do that.
Absolutely. Do you remember your first APS meeting?
Yeah, I believe it was when I was in graduate school, and it was in Nashville, I believe, must have been maybe 2003, 2004, maybe. A group of other graduate students drove up from Gainesville in a van, and it was a wonderful time.
Yeah, my first one was in Quebec City, I think in 2006, and I was living in Maine at the University of Maine. And
I attended that one as well in Quebec City. That was a wonderful meeting.
absolutely. Now you have over 60 peer-reviewed publications, a lot of them focused on Phytophthora, trichoderma-mycete interactions, fungal biocontrols, especially a yellow star thistle. Setting aside your administrative and program leader hat for a second, are there certain pathogens or pathosystems that you found to be most enjoyable or challenging or inspiring to work with?
I've always been partial to Phytophthora species. That's what I did my PhD work on, and I always had two great advisors, Dr. Dave Mitchell and Dr. Jim Graham. Both of them were Phytophthora experts, and so I had a great tutelage underneath them, and I owe them a lot of my credit to my career because they did teach me well. And then I got away from the Phytophtheras somewhat when I went and did work with biological control of weeds in the lab in France, although I had a small project in Cameroon that came back on Phytophthora and cacao. And then when I came back to the States and worked, the project was on exotic Phytophtheras. That was the time when Phytophthora ramorum was starting to hit its big impact, and they needed another person to do some research on the eastern shore rather than on the west.
Right, and you were at Fort Detrick, so you were well positioned to work there with that quarantine pathogen.
Exactly. That's right.
So you were in France in what, 2004?
From 2000 to 2006.
Oh, you were there longer. Okay.
I was out there 6 years. That was my first position within USDA ARS. ARS has a small lab there. It's the only lab owned by the USDA outside of the US, and they do biological control of invasive species. And so I spent 6 years. That was the amount of time we were allowed to stay there, 6 years at State Department regulations. And so then I had to come back to another lab, and I was fortunate to find a position there in Fort Detrick.
And of course, that positioned you well for attending the APS meeting in Quebec because your French was probably superb by that point.
I wouldn't say superb, but it was great to have that atmosphere because of that French connection. It really, I think that's one of the reasons why that was one of my favorite meetings as well. Yeah.
So coming back to Phytophthora work, your PhD in Florida, you worked on Phytophthora. What Phytophthora species did you work on?
It was Nicotiana, so root rot of citrus.
Is that still a problem today, or have they bred their way out of that problem, or what's?
Well, it is still a problem, but of course, compared to citrus greening, HLB, it really fails in comparison, but yet it still has a significant impact on the citrus industry.
And what was it like getting on the ground floor of working on P. ramorum, such an important pathogen of woody perennial plants, certainly out in the West, but there was so much fear about it being introduced into the natural settings here in the East.
Exactly. In all models, it indicated that it was going to spread here to the East Coast, and for whatever reason, it really has never established. Although there was some findings, of course, it was very exciting and great to work with so many other people on the West Coast that had so much already experience on it. And then here working with Paul Tooley and Nina Shishkoff, they were starting to work on it as well. And so we each had our own little niches and what we were working on. And mine was biological control and also testing some other native species that might be susceptible to it and how it might spread within the East Coast if it ever did establish here.
And how effective were the biocontrols you were testing on these? I assume you were testing on P. ramorum, but were you looking at the efficacy towards other Phytophthora species as well?
For that particular one, it was almost all ramorum that I concentrated on. And there was a trichoderma species, and I got a patent for its use. And I had a company that was interested in it. They had other priorities then that came about, and so it never really developed, but it was very effective. And I was able to test it in the field we had set up a mock nursery out in California, Dominican University. And so I was able to set up some trials out there. And it was very effective in reducing soil-borne inoculum, the chlamydospores of the Phytophthora ramorum.
So one of the things that I think about in recent years is that we've seen a real change in The winter weather patterns here in the East. I'm in the central Appalachian region in West Virginia. We see a lot more precipitation in the form of rain. And I'm wondering if the scales are tipping possibly in favor of things like Phytophthora ramorum. Clearly, in the past, we have a susceptible host, we have a virulent pathogen, but we don't really have a favorable environment. Do you think that there's enough ongoing research that can understand how the change in weather patterns and precipitation patterns could potentially favor P. ramorum in the East in the future?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that with the changing environment and especially phytophthors love a moist, wet environment. And so if increasing rains and the dew periods, which is critical for establishment as well, increases, then certainly it could become still even more problematic even here on the East Coast. And I believe still there's ongoing research and looking at those types of things. I'm not sure how much more is still being done here on the East Coast, but I know there's some still going on the West Coast, and that certainly can translate into research here on the East Coast as well, developing models and things like that.
Yeah. I was surprised but happy when I was doing some work out in 2021 in California that we applied for a permit to sample in state parks, and they wanted to know our disinfestation plan for P. ramorum. So it was good to see that these things were still being implemented and they were thinking about the consequences of these pathogens.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it would be a disservice to our listeners, particularly those that are APS members that are listening and experiencing these kind of seismic shifts in policy and funding around agriculture and biosecurity and trade. As a former national program lead for plant diseases, how will these changes that we're seeing impact our ability to detect, manage, and eradicate invasive pests and pathogens here in the US?
I'm hopeful that it won't impact it too much. Change is always difficult when new things come in. As we adjust and redirect and focus our efforts, there's also opportunities, I think, to then focus on more important things. Diagnostics and detection, I think, is probably one of the most important and key components of early mitigation methods and trying to not prevent something from establishing. I think it may have a short-term impact, but I think in the long term, I don't foresee a huge real impact on it as we still progress.
I was reading some 16,000 USDA employees opted for this deferred resignation program. And the article mentioned a number of APHIS workers opted in for the DRP, but it also mentioned now USDA is asking APHIS employees to rethink that decision because I think more people took the DRP than they anticipated. I wonder about those shortages of staff. APHIS is on the front lines of preventing the introduction of invasive pests and pathogens. And I think you and I could easily sit here and come up with 5,000 reasons APHIS is important to domestic agriculture. But can you maybe explain to the listeners why maintaining, if not increasing funding for USDA, including like ARS, which you're so involved with, APHIS and the Forest Service are important at this point in time?
Yeah, funding, of course, is what, really is how we, keep the research going. And just so, it's understood, ARS is the research arm of the USDA, and we supply a lot of the data to APHIS that makes then the regulatory decisions to, as you said, protect U.S. agriculture. So they're intertwined. And of course, the Forest Service also produces a lot of data for protecting our forest, and ARS works often with the Forest Service for on some of those forestry projects as well. And of course, even before maybe all of this happened, and I am biased, but the funding was not as high as it should be. And when you compare the funding that went to agriculture research compared to the funding that goes to for CDC or HHS, I mean, it's really pale in comparison. Now, granted, human health and animal and plant health, maybe you can make some argument as to which is more important and which maybe should deserve more funding. But yet, food and agriculture is vital to everyone and everyone's health, and so it's really the basis. And increasing funding for research, I think, not only increases human health, food security, political stability, because around the world, that's starvation and hunger are one of the most leading causes for instability. And having a good food supply is security and biodefense security, national security. And having research on that is a key component and contributes to all of that.
Absolutely. And although you didn't directly mention the term or the kind of concept, you were talking about the concept, and that's the One Health concept.
Right.
That
Exactly.
that what we do in agriculture is directly connected to human health. The overuse of fungicides in fruit production could lead to more antifungal resistant strains of Aspergillus fumigatus, which
Right.
may lead to more infections in humans that are challenging to fight. So funding in agriculture to understand these inputs and better use in an integrated pest management system might lead to better measures of health in humans.
Yeah, and when I was on this White House task force for developing a One Health for the biodefense strategy, I was really the only plant person on that, and most of the participants were from CDC and HHS and those agencies, and so it really became an important voice. And I think after I had a chance to participate and speak in that, a lot of those other participants from those agencies started to realize the importance of agriculture in the One Health arena as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you were there to represent our profession and plant scientists as well. It's hard to look at the early career scientists that are being riffed or taking this DRP program, not think about maybe the betrayal they feel. Even if positions open back up, I worry that entire generation of service minded scientists won't be interested in coming to work for the federal government. And that critical window that allows for transfer of knowledge may not exist. How do we encourage scientists that are early in their careers when there's not a lot of positions? How do we find a path forward for them?
I can understand their feelings of betrayal. I think any position has risks. And in the past, a government position was always one of real stability and probably a lesser risk of losing that position compared to maybe university positions or private industry positions as well. And now maybe that has slightly changed a little bit, but these things go in cycles, and maybe if another administration comes in, then, it might change. And I guess my advice, and I've spoken to other postdoc groups and student groups, and you have to weigh the options of what's, best for you and what risks are you willing to take. My presentations were always the good, the bad, and the ugly for working for the government. There's a lot of great things. There still is a lot of great things. There's some bad things, and then there's some ugly things, but I always compared that with 2 other positions as well, and I think there are good, bad, and ugly things with university positions and with private industry as well. So it just depends on what the individual wants and what they feel more comfortable with in those good and bad and ugly aspects of any
Yeah.
position.
Yeah. And I want to clarify that I understand each new administration has policies, and priorities change. Similarly, at universities, as we get a new president or a new provost, those things change. And we've seen some dramatic changes in academia recently, too. So I want to pivot a little bit, say that even though that you officially retired from ARS, I know you're still serving in a consultant role, but really, I'm curious what pathogens, pests, or invasive weeds do you think pose the greatest threats to U.S. agriculture and forestry today? I know that you've worked on things like P. ramorum, and I'm not downplaying things that are already here because we know that there's reemergence of historic pathogens and pests. But what do you see as some of the new players and the risks they pose to our agriculture and forestry resources?
I think one of the big risks that are still concerning, and we focused a lot of research on this, is UG99, the wheat rust, and it is spreading around. And unfortunately, we've had some time to work on it and get some good resistant lines and cultivars so that if it does show up here, then, maybe we can weather that storm and survive it okay. The other one is wheat blast. That one too is a little scary as it also moves around more and more. And that we have less of a handle on some resistance for that. And so that one, we still need a lot more research on that. So that's it on the food side of things, and that significantly could impact and tar spot as well. That one's been around maybe since 2015, I think, and it's starting more and more to spread. And that one too is a concern again for a food crop.
That's on corn, right?
Corn, exactly right. Yeah. And if you look at more maybe they're all food crops, but I'd say staple crops. Let me put it that way. Peanut smut is another good example of potential problem to the peanut industry. And there are other numerous viruses on tomatoes. There was tomato brown rugose fruit virus that came through and is still problematic. There's some other tomato viruses that threaten. And a lot of these also are threatening trade, of course, as well. And that's another economic impact, not just on food supply. Carnal bunt is still always as a problem, even though it really is not a problem on yields, but because of the way the trade deals are made, any contamination with carnal bunt will prohibit that from reaching its final destination. Those kinds of things are still problematic. Citrus greening, even though it's here in Florida, it's still threatening California, where it has not been found yet in a commercial grove. It's been found in some backyards. So that too is still problematic in terms with the citrus industry here in the United States.
In interviewing past guests, I learned that there's been an uptick in citrus production elsewhere, like southern Texas and Arizona and places like that, where they may not be growing the same kinds of citrus, but they're definitely increasing domestic citrus production for U.S. consumption. And they may have some of the same contemporary threats that citrus producers in California and Florida have to deal with. Now, Phytophthora is something that you probably still have a pretty good pulse on, just because you're aware of these things. Are there new Phytophtheras on the horizon that are popping up and presenting problems elsewhere that we worry about being introduced here?
There always seems to be, as I think, especially with the molecular studies, and you're finding more and more hybrids between different Phytophthora species, and these can result in maybe new host associations. And of course, and the different mating types and the spread of that always presents new problems because they present new host associations. Another possible kind of related oomycete, phytopithiums, seem to be a little more. And again, as things warm up, because these used to be more a tropical pathogen, and as temperatures seem to be rising, then this could present new problems in new areas where phytopithiums never were problematic before. I was just reviewing some information on some of our research on phytopithium, and phytopithium apparently has been found in Florida citrus soil since the 1960s, but yet some of the isolates that they've now pulled out are just as problematic on citrus roots as Phytophthora palmivera or Phytophthora nicotiana, causing some root rot damage. And I know in other parts of the world, China and Thailand, that it's becoming more and more problematic with phytopithiums as well. These things are starting to change again with the changing environment a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Now, to remind our listeners, Phytophthora, it's not a fungus, but it's an oomycete, and that's a fungus-like organism, but there's some nuances about it that make it difficult to manage. Phytophthora infestans is the causal agent of late blight, the disease that led to the Irish potato famine, and most people are familiar with that event. Let me ask this question. Is it more challenging to manage oomycetes because they are distinct from fungi and they require... It's my understanding that some fungicides work against them, but they're not fungi, obviously. Is there challenges to working with management of Phytophthora?
Yeah, and I think you hit on it mainly exactly there, because they're actually more closely related to brown algae than they are to the true fungi. And so algicides can be somewhat effective, but most of the commercial fungicides are not, and a lot of the industry has been devoted towards true fungi. And there are some oomycete products that are very effective, but one of the I think, difficulties is because of the genetics of Phytophthora, resistance is easily developed to products. And so one has to be very careful as to how much is applied, like fungicides, an example, but because it can be sexual hybridization and such, resistance can easily develop to these products.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've worked a lot on biocontrol, particularly yellow star thistle. You've evaluated a chytrid for its efficacy against the yellow star thistle. Typically, we see a lot of rust pathogens being used as biocontrols of weeds because of their high degree of host specificity and their status as obligate biotrophs. So, what led you to investigate a chytrid as a biocontrol? Was it just found naturally occurring, or?
Yeah, it was found naturally occurring at that time when I first went to France. And yellow star thistle was one of the major weeds in the West, and so that was my main target, and so I was exploring around Europe and such for different pathogens and happened to come across this in France, actually very close to the lab, this chytrid, Syncytium. It was a new species that I had described and worked in collaboration here back with the Beltsville lab that was on systematics and of fungi. And it had some impact on it, and so we pursued it a little further and looked at different hosts. There was another host on it that was planted in California. Even though it was very minor, it didn't infect it very much. There was some fear that it would go to that host, and so it never really was pursued as a biocontrol agent.
Got it. Got it. For those listeners unfamiliar with biocontrol, when we're thinking about using a microorganism or a microbe against another microorganism or against a plant or things like that, we often care about how effective it is at the target host, but we also equally weigh the non-target impacts. That is, what other hosts, whether they're botanically related or not, are impacted by that. And finding a non-target host doesn't kill the potential pursuit of a biocontrol, but you have to proceed with caution and weighing the cost and benefits of these things, correct?
Yeah, exactly, and especially when you're bringing in an exotic or a foreign pathogen, there's always that fear, even though, there's really been no proof or evidence that it has ever happened, that it's jumped to an alternate host that was not first identified at some point along the way. But there is always that fear, and so you always have to be extremely careful and do a lot of host range testing before ever introducing a new and exotic pathogen. And any little bit that it would be infected is then of great concern, especially in the classical biocontrol approach where the idea is to release it at one time and then let it spread naturally.
Right. And some of the frustrations with biocontrol are that things take a long time. They're not as quick as chemicals. You have to do your due diligence and make sure under quarantine that there's not going to be this unexpected jump to a native species, because then you're doing more harm than good. Although that may take 6 or 10 years to do a thorough host range testing, at least you've been exhaustive. That way you release it. You said, we've considered all possibilities, all possible hosts, and the cost of releasing it outweighs the cost of killing it in the lab.
And that was the nice thing about the setup for the lab in France, because we could do all those initial screenings outside of the US in its natural habitat and just eliminate any one of those already that may have multiple hosts or may threaten other hosts in the US even before we bring it into the US. And the lab in France is a great way to help protect US agriculture by even not introducing them for initial screenings in that first place.
I imagine working at Fort Detrick with some of these quarantine pathogens, that's a pretty serious environment.
Yeah, it is working it's a BSL-3, a biosecurity level 3 containment facility, and we put on medical scrubs going in, and then we had to shower coming out. It reminded me of working in a submarine where you go through and the doors close behind you and you're locked in there for a little while. But yeah, that's the way it was. That in Fort Detrick, it used to be the old biowarfare's lab, and then when Nixon relinquished that program, he gave that facility to the USDA to work on foreign pathogens because it was a safe environment and we could have permits to pretty much bring in anything in the world and work it in there.
I imagine it's one of those scenarios where you get a call from the school, pick up your kids. It's not something you can run out and do when you're going into that quarantine to BSL-3 lab. It takes time to get in, to do your work and get out.
Yeah, you really have to organize your time well because you don't want to shower 3 or 4 times a day if you can avoid it by coming in, not forgetting something and realizing, oh, I got to go out and get that and come back in again. So it does take a good amount of organization.
I previously interviewed Manon Gallagly back when he was still alive, and he worked there during the war or at the end of World War II in the biowarfare lab developing pathogens of rice. So I've heard early stories from when it was still doing biowarfare stuff before it was relinquished to the USDA.
Yeah, it's got a great history of those things. Obviously, it's bad connotation, negative things, but it is part of the history, and it's just a fascinating place to work.
Yeah. So you retired officially in 2024, yet you're still a consultant. I wonder what made you decide to give up your career and go into consulting?
It was just getting time. I never wanted to stay forever in one position. So it was just a good time to move on and try and maybe do some other things. But yet, I didn't also want to just completely cut myself off because I think scientists are the type of people who have a hard time doing that, just leaving something and not at least slowly transitioning out of it. So I think it would have been difficult if I had just completely cut myself off and not had this opportunity to continue on in some capacity.
I noticed on your CV that you had, was it top secret security clearance? Is that what that means? Is that maybe one of the other incentives to stay is that you still have like current clearance to work with these agencies and not have to be revetted because you're already still, even though you're retired, you're still, all your credentials are up to date, right?
Unfortunately, no, I had to give up all my security clearance. So I don't have the security clearance anymore. But that was one of the fascinating aspects of the job, and one of the things I did enjoy, interacting with Department of Homeland Security and the CIA and other agencies on plant health related activities.
I won't even ask what the CIA was interested in, but that's pretty interesting. We're closely approaching the end of the time we have together. I thought maybe I'd give you an opportunity to offer some advice for early career scientists looking for opportunities to serve their country the way you have for your career.
Thanks. And Matt, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on the podcast and talk. Again, I would like people still to consider government as a viable option for a career choice. I still think, to me, for my position, it was the best decision that I ever made. I know that other people may prefer other positions, private industry, as I said, and universities, they have their advantages as well. But for me personally, it was a great opportunity, gave me a chance, especially in the position early on that I had. I got to travel all over the world and make what I feel is a significant impact in agriculture. A little bit on the research side, mainly then as my career developed. And you can advance in the government. And I think I'm a great poster child for that. I don't think I have any great special abilities except just dedication and putting the efforts in, and anybody can do that. And you can take different leadership responsibilities and roles. There are opportunities to advance in that. And I think that's one of the nice things I think of working for the government is that you can have those opportunities and also make a significant impact in agriculture. And despite what's maybe the atmosphere today, I would still encourage people to consider working for the USDA as a good career choice. I still think it's a good career choice.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being here and really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you, Matt, for the opportunity. And I again appreciate and feel very honored again to be selected as an APS Fellow.
Absolutely. And enjoy that award banquet. I'm sure you're going to be attending in the great location of Honolulu.
I hope so.
We've just heard from Dr. Tim Widmer, plant pathologist and former USDA ARS National Program Leader for Plant Disease. Dr. Widmer currently serves as an independent contractor and plant health and biodefense specialist for both USDA ARS and private industry. Be sure to check out the show notes for this episode immediately following the episode description. I'm Matt Kasson, host of Plantopia. Thanks for listening.